BRZEN.
The entire command had to be in your pocket. And that's what happened. Everybody was in my pocket. I had them in my palm. I was just rolling them around.
The defense contractor, Leonard Glenn Francis, pled guilty to fraud and bribery in the largest corruption scandal in U.S. Navy history.
Leonard was very good at influencing people.
He makes you feel included in the conversation.
He was, a go-getter.
He's monetized debauchery. He just really made it an empire.
I must have been naive, how I didn't see this, how I did not realize what they were doing.
His intention was certainly to intimidate me.
He always threatened me and my family.
Fat Leonard.
Fat Leonard.
Oh, Leonard.
He's heard from Leonard.
Big boy.
Fat Leonard.
Fat Leonard.
He's very dangerous. He's very evil person.
I mean, I pretty much sealed my fate with my marriage in the fact that I've turned over every dirty little thing I could.
They came running in, the guns blazing.
Leonard does deserve to go to jail, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he's pleaded guilty.
Oh, yeah. Oh, definitely.
If the Navy would have charged every officer or admiral that were involved with me, the Navy would not have any more admirals left in the Navy.
There is at least some popular perception of what we would call different spanks for different ranks. When they look up and see an admiral who was able to retire with full benefits and just got a mean letter, that doesn't feel like an even-handed way to treat this.
I'm Tom Wright, host of the Fat Leonard podcast, and I'm here with some updates. Since our season finished airing in late November, some extremely unexpected developments have taken place. Early last year, I smuggled a microphone to Leonard, who was in home detention in San Diego. Over more than 20 hours of raw audio, Leonard told me the shocking, unvarnished story of how over 2 decades he set up a mafia-like organization inside the US Navy. Leonard was a military contractor who supplied food, fuel, and security to Navy ships in the Pacific. In return for overcharging by tens of millions of dollars, Leonard told me how he supplied Navy officers with prostitutes, fine dinners, cigars, and vacations. He lived in our $130 million mansion with 20 luxury cars. Leonard was motivated to speak to me because he says he's a scapegoat. Arrested in 2013, he pleaded guilty 2 years later and has been cooperating with the government. In 2017, he was allowed out of jail for home arrest after he was diagnosed with kidney cancer. He's still to be sentenced, and that's because he's the star witness in the trials of 5 Navy officers charged with bribery and other crimes that begin this week in federal court in San Diego. Over 20 Navy officers have pleaded guilty for their role in Leonard's corruption. But these 5 have pleaded not guilty, meaning Leonard has to wait around in detention. And that's one reason he talked to me for the podcast. Another is Leonard says top admirals have gotten off scot-free for their role in the corruption. The 5 Navy officers heading to trial this week allegedly received entertainment and prostitute after prostitute in return for pushing lucrative business to Leonard's company. So we were shocked when the defense counsel for the 5 men, represented by a San Diego lawyer called Todd Burns, sought to get hold of the raw tapes of my interviews with Leonard. He couldn't force me to hand over the tapes because I'm based in Singapore. So in October, he filed a subpoena to our partner, Audiation, a New York podcast company. Our company, Project Brazen, intervened to quash the subpoena. Under the First Amendment of the US Constitution, reporters have what's called qualified privilege. This is meant to protect journalists from attempts to interfere with reporters' work, and that includes rifling through our notebooks and asking to look at our raw tapes. Think of what it would mean if journalists couldn't do their work without fear a government or court would force them to hand over notes, potentially exposing their sources. Well, that's the reality now in places like Russia and China. In December, we learned that Judge Janice Sammartino, who is hearing the case in federal court in San Diego, had ordered us to turn over the tapes to the defense counsel. She ruled the defendant's due process rights superseded our qualified privilege under the First Amendment. It's hard to express just how much we disagree with the ruling. It's a complicated issue, so just bear with me. In the podcast, Leonard makes comments that might bring his reliability as a witness into question, the defense counsel said. That includes Leonard's comments that could be interpreted to mean he has exaggerated his illness to stay in home arrest rather than prison, and the fact that he has withheld some evidence from the government, including recordings of sex involving Navy officers. The defense counsel argued they needed access to all our tapes to ensure Leonard didn't say anything else that might disqualify him as a witness. In US First Amendment jurisprudence, when a judge considers whether to force a journalist to hand over information, she must show that information is unavailable from other sources. Given that Leonard will appear on the stand in the trial and will be available to Mr. Burns for cross-examination, this, in our view, was clearly not the case. And don't just take our word for it. I talked to David Loy, an expert on First Amendment law, about our case. David, a former civil liberties litigator, is legal director of the First Amendment Coalition, a California-based nonprofit that advocates for free speech. Hi, David. Thanks for coming on and talking to us. I wanted to get your thoughts on this ruling by the judge.
I tend to agree that this was very much an overbroad and premature ruling by the judge. I mean, certainly people accused of crimes have substantial constitutional rights to present a defense, to cross-examine the primary witness against them, to confront their accuser, and that's important. But as you say, the press have First Amendment rights as well, and the press is the only private profession, private institution explicitly named in the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights. And the framers singled out a free press for a reason, because the press has and needs to fulfill an independent function in a thriving democracy, which is to report the truth, speak truth to power, be an independent check on government, and an independent guardian of the people's right to know. And so anytime that the press is or could be viewed as an arm of the prosecution or defense, or a tool of the prosecution or defense in a civil or criminal case, that is a potential threat to the independence and integrity of the press. It compromises reporters' ability to cultivate the trust of their sources, to gather the news, and draws them into the litigation of civil and criminal disputes that, and not only does it compromise their independence, it's a drain on their time and resources.
One issue that's bothered me is this idea put forward by the defense counsel in their subpoena that we would have somehow left out juicy material from my interviews that would disqualify Leonard as a witness. Of course, I did not do that. And the fact that one of the Navy officers involved in subpoenaing our tapes has since pleaded guilty and won't even stand trial shows his counsel found nothing of importance in the raw tapes.
The decision whether people plead out or not is governed by a multitude of factors and circumstances, but yeah, it does cause one to wonder how earth-shattering the outtakes might be. And I presume that you, as a reporter, if you had anything in the interviews that was of great significance to the government's case, I think you would have a motivation and an institutional interest to publicize your best material. You're not going to hold back anything that is of significant interest or significant value to reporting on this case. So it's something the judge seems to overlook.
Well, that's what I find so offensive about the ruling. It's like, why would I have held back Leonard impeaching himself as a witness from the podcast? That's what we do. We were inspired to do this podcast and spend months and months working on it because we believe there's been a cover-up in this case, that it hasn't been fully litigated, and that a lot of very senior admirals in the Navy who were involved with Leonard got off scot-free. So that's the motivation and the importance of journalism. And that the idea that then we would collude with Leonard to hide some of his statements is just ridiculous and offensive to us as journalists. The judge ruled that Leonard, cross-examined on the stand, could have said I had taken him out of context regarding any comments that undercut his reliability as witness against the 5 Navy officers. But even if that was the case, the judge could then have ruled for us to turn over relevant portions of our raw tapes, David says.
If anything is going to be released at all, it should be done in a much more surgical manner, as you say, much more granular, much more precise, to do as little damage as possible to the interests of the press in reporting the news, while also respecting the defendant's right to a fair trial and cross-examine the accuser.
The problem with that, of course, is that it would have made for a less efficient trial proceeding. In the process, the judge trampled on press freedom.
It is disturbing that this particular judge does seem to have just skipped over and effectively minimized and degraded the value of an independent press in this particular ruling. It's disturbing that there are at least some courts or some judges willing to disregard the importance of a robust and independent free press. So I certainly don't think that we're over the cliff by any stretch, but I think it's important to be appropriately concerned about any potential early warning signs that there's any weakening or potential weakening in the foundations of the First Amendment.
But it's not all bad news. Our podcast also shone a light on the misogyny in the Navy. Leonard didn't just organize orgies for Navy officers. He acknowledged in the podcast to helping cover up sexual abuses by officers, paying off women and police in far-flung ports. Don Christensen, a former chief prosecutor of the Air Force, is president of Protect Our Defenders. He says our podcast helped to inform the debate in the U.S.
Well, I think it's really exposed to a lot of people who had kind of denial to the extent of misogyny in the military. It's just seeing naval officers accept prostitutes as a bribe to give up secret information, I think shocked a lot of people. And then a huge disappointment that accountability is coming through the Department of Justice instead of the military. And the fact that so many high-ranking officers seem to have no accountability.
After years of fighting for more accountability, Protect Our Defenders, another group, scored a major success in December when Congress agreed to a new defense bill that changes the way the military prosecutes sexual assault. In the past, military commanders have decided whether to push ahead with prosecutions of men within their chain of command. In many instances, this meant sexual assault cases were dropped. The new rules, which are being brought in over a 2-year implementation period, hands that power to an independent military prosecutor outside of the chain of command.
We've been engaged in a 10-year battle to reform the military justice system. It's unlike any other justice system in the country, where instead of prosecutors making decisions, commanders make decisions. The commanders will often know the accused, or through the chain of command, they know the accused. So finally, after that 10-year struggle, this year we got legislation for probably 11 most serious common crimes we have in the military. We're going to be outside of the chain of command and brought into an independent prosecutor's office to determine whether or not someone should be prosecuted.
Congress began to investigate a decade ago, but continued high rates of sexual abuse and the murder of a female soldier, Vanessa Guillen, in Fort Hood in 2020 after she was sexually harassed, added to pressure for action in December, Don says.
It's still a problem. Sexual harassment is still very high. The surveys show that it's about 25% of women say they were sexually harassed in a year. At the service academies, we're developing our new future leadership. Sexual harassment for women was 50% each academic year. So if you have an environment where you have a lot of sexual harassment, you're going to have a higher rate of sexual assault. So they just weren't solving the problem, despite all their assurances to Congress they would solve the problem.
Don is hopeful the appointment of independent prosecutors to decide on whether to move forward with sexual assault cases will make a big difference.
This is a massive change for the military justice system. That's something that I hope personally will get us to a better place. And I also hope will bring better faith in the process to those who've been victimized in the military.
And finally, I just wanted to give you an update on some of the women who suffered at the hands of Leonard. In episode 6, we profiled Morena de Jesus, the mother of 2 children with Leonard. Morena told us the chilling story of how Leonard abducted the children. Leonard was proud of how he was raising the children alone in house arrest in San Diego as he awaited this week's trials, and after that, his own sentencing. How the US government allowed this to happen, despite court orders in Singapore and the Philippines for their return to Morena, is unclear. The US DOJ declined to answer questions. Since Morena's episode aired, she's filed a lawsuit in the US for access to her children, whom she hasn't seen in a decade. They are both teenagers. I also checked back in with Marcy Misiewicz, the wife of Michael Misiewicz, a former Navy commander who went to jail for corruption. Marcy told, for the first time, how she played a role in bringing down Leonard by taking her suspicions about her husband to the NCIS.
Hey, Marcy, it's great to talk to you again. It's been a while. What's happened to you since you spoke out against what happened in the Fat Leonard case in the Navy?
A lot of personal friends, family, military friends have reached out and just complimented me for being brave and A lot of feedback that I've gotten has been, gosh, we knew that stuff was going on, but we didn't realize to the depth of everything, and just talked how they learned some things, not just from the part where I spoke, but across the whole entirety of the podcast, just stuff that was covered in it. People have, were surprised and disappointed and upset, and just, it's been interesting feedback.
While the comments online have been overwhelmingly positive, it's probably no surprise that some men have weighed in with their misogynistic bunk. Marcy has helped ruin the Navy. That kind of nonsense. In fact, the debate we've sparked with this podcast can only be good for the Navy, an institution in which her son is now serving while his dad is in prison.
I suppose you probably did this because you have a personal reason for doing it, and also a reason that you would like to see the Navy, an institution that your son is still serving in. You would want to see it improved for the better because of all of this, right?
Correct. And it's also, there could be a spouse out there who's in a similar situation across any branch, not just the Navy, who doesn't understand or doesn't know that they have a voice and they should be able to speak out, and it should be well received. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but it should be
heard.
Commands should be receptive to listening to what we or what the spouses have to say. Again, it wasn't easy for me as a wife of a commander to go to the chain of command and talk about this stuff.
Now Marcy is watching for news of these, the first public trials in the Fat Leonard case. Leonard will give testimony, and then, when he's sentenced, maybe later this year, Marcy is hoping for justice for a man who helped destroy her family.
I just want justice. I just want people to be held accountable.
We'll have a reporter at the trials, so watch out for future bonus episodes of Fat Leonard.